Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Glad to have you along for our program today. Today we're going to be listening to a conversation between Jordan Peterson, the public intellectual, and author Eric Metaxas, who has written a new book called Letters to the American Church. And excellent book. I highly recommend it. But today we're going to be looking at their conversation as they talk about censorship in our nation, the United States, and in the Western nations as a whole, particularly the last few years with this COVID pandemic. We're seeing more and more censorship. Free speech is being questioned by many of the elites in society, by many of the intellectuals, politicians, parties, specifically like the Democratic Party and the leftists. There is a loss of faith in the actual ability of free citizens to think and process information for themselves. And this really affects us as Christians because we have to have an environment where we can actually preach the gospel and speak of Christian topics. And if we don't have a free society and there's no free speech, that's going to play a factor in our ability to get out the message and teach God's word. And so I want to jump into this conversation that Jordan Peterson is having with author Eric Metaxas and just jump in at certain points and comment, because I too have experienced censorship over the last 2 or 3 years during the time of the pandemic. And I had never really experienced it before. But then all of a sudden, over the last 2 or 3 years, censorship has just been coming at me and coming at all Christian, and we have to be prepared for it. We have to be aware of it. Many of the churches in our Christian world have basically denied that there's any problem and have gone on as if nothing is happening. But we need to open our eyes and we wake up, and we have to realize that we may soon not be able to teach our Christian faith. And if we do, we may suffer consequences and be thrown in jail. We may be highly fined. We may lose house and home. And there may be some severe consequences that we would have never imagined because of our cultural situation here in the United States. We've been a home of the brave, land of the free. And nowadays, though, the land of the free is not something we can just take for granted. So let's jump into this conversation with Eric Metaxas and Jordan Peterson and hear what they have to say. And I think it'll be an interesting learning experience for us all.
Let's turn to that now. Because of the seriousness of what you were writing, and you pointed specifically to the events of the last 3 years, and this is probably what'll get this whole discussion canceled on YouTube, by the way.
Good.
Because that's increasingly happening. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
3. They've taken 3 of my videos down in the last month, by the way. What is it exactly that you think is afoot? Why do you think it's akin to the sorts of things that were happening while the totalitarian state was rising in Germany? And
You've just said it. The YouTube canceling your conversations. How extraordinarily preposterous and sick is that?
Yeah, this is something that is shocking if you haven't experienced it, but it's really shocking if you have experienced it. Here I am as a Christian broadcaster. Here I am as a pastor. Here is a Bible teacher and someone who speaks out on moral and spiritual issues. I try to confine myself normally to the spiritual realm and to the moral realm. As a minister of the gospel, as a pastor, that is the emphasis of the Bible. That is the emphasis of the Christian church. And so I try to stay clear of pure political issues. Now, sometimes it's very hard to stay away from political issues because there's always a little bit of a moral component in it. There's always a little bit of a spiritual component, even something that you would look at and say, well, that's obviously a political issue. I don't see any connection with that with the church or with our faith. But if you look deeper, there's always some kind of spiritual, moral, character angle to it. So it's very tempting to get drawn into political issues and then spend all your time talking about political issues. Well, that's not the calling of the Christian church. It's not the calling of a pastor to go basically into pure political issues. It is the calling of the pastor and the church to address the moral and spiritual issues primarily as they come up in society. And so that's what I've tried to do. And what has happened as a consequence is I've been censored on YouTube probably about a half a dozen times. Some of the videos have been completely removed. Some of the videos have been challenged. I've been able to challenge them and then on appeal get them to stay. So maybe about 3/4 of the videos that have been censored on my channel have never seen the light of day again on YouTube because they were just simply taken off and all of the appeals were refused. But there were a few that I've actually fought and actually got reinstated and reposted. So it's alarming to think that a pastor can be talking about things. For example, when the vaccine first came on the scene, I wanted to analyze what a vaccine was and what are the moral components, what went into making these vaccines, and is there any problem or potential problems for Christians. And I wanted to lay out the whole landscape of the issue, and I did so, and the video was pulled down, claiming that I was giving out medical misinformation. So I couldn't even carry on a ethical, moral, Christian worldview analysis of the new RNA vaccines. Very alarming. You know, why does YouTube care so much about what I talk about? As long as I'm not trying to foment revolution and trying to engineer some kind of government toppling and trying to isolate individuals and encourage violence or something like that, obviously. But why would YouTube care if I'm having an intelligent conversation from a Christian viewpoint? Again, this is just raw power that's being exercised, and these two are experiencing the same thing.
Mind-bending that in the West, we would have some arbiters out there deciding what is okay and what is not okay. That's despicable. Speaking as an American, it is profoundly anti-American. I think of the blood of patriots who died for freedom of speech. So it is, on the one hand, deeply offensive to me in that way.
Exactly. I mean, it is very offensive to people who understand what great strides we've made here in the United States in the area of freedom and freedom of speech. There are plenty of countries in this world where you cannot utter words, utter sentences, cannot say and formulate speeches and talks and you can't even talk about certain things where you'll get arrested and thrown in jail or shipped out to a gulag someplace or disappeared where nobody ever sees you again. There are countries like that. But the United States has always been a beacon of freedom where you could talk about anything you want to talk about. I mean, there were communist parties during the early days of the Russian Revolution here in the United States. And as long as they didn't try anything like to undermine the government or foment a revolution or something, you could have a communist party here, American Communist Party. You could have, for example, there is a Democratic Socialist Party. You can have all kinds of political persuasions. You can have all kinds of religious beliefs. You can they even give the Church of Satan permission to meet and carry out whatever evil things that they carry out, unless they're involving human sacrifice or some kind of violence. But these groups can have freedom of speech, but all of a sudden, in the last 2 or 3 years, people like who are the leaders at YouTube and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter before Elon Musk and all kinds of the mainstream media, this rise of censorship where if you see views that just don't align with yours, you can just make them go away. You can just ban them from the forum, from the public square. And it's never been like this before in the United States. We've never seen anything like this. And it's really, really alarming. And we as Christians have to realize that we are facing a future, if this trend continues, we're facing a future where there will come a day when we can't even talk about what sin is from a biblical perspective, because that will be illegal, or that will be censored or labeled hate speech, and it'll be banned from all the media platforms, and it may even be illegal that you're thrown in jail. It may be offensive to people in power that you criticize immoral lifestyles, or if you try to discourage certain behavioral practices that are immoral according to the Bible, you may be labeled as a hate speech, or spreading misinformation and thrown in jail, or fined, or your career ruined, canceled, blacklisted from your career field. All of these things could be coming down the pipe in the future unless we stand up and say, no, this is wrong, and we need to fight for our freedom of speech in order to teach God's word. Because there's the whole agenda of teaching God's word. We have to teach God's word because our world is messed up. It's confused. It's believing lies. It's going on the path of destruction, and we have to be there to help them, to save them. And we can't do that unless we have the freedom to teach God's word.
But as a human being, it's deeply offensive to me. As a Christian, it's offensive to me because I believe that we are all free to speak truth. So the idea that we would be alive at a time in the West where in places like Canada and America and the West, somebody would dare to be shutting down what you and I and most people know are perfectly wonderful conversations. We know that it's not like, well, yeah, I guess they had a point. They had less than no point.
That's right. These are arbitrary decisions made by people in power who have the power to pull the plug on your microphone. And that's exactly what they have done to me in about half a dozen situations. That's what happened to Jordan Peterson last month or so. About 3 or 4 of his videos were pulled down. Perfectly fine conversations. Here's a public intellectual who is simply talking about topics that the powers that be don't want talked about, or he's talking about them from a perspective that they don't want out in public. They don't want people to hear this conversation. They don't want people to think for themselves. They want people to simply believe what the mainstream media and the propaganda machinery are telling them and not question it and not even know that there are any alternative ways of looking at something. When we talked, for example, about the LGBTQ movement and how this transgender movement is hurting children, especially young girls, and there's sort of a social contagion at some junior high and high schools where it's now fashionable for a lot of these confused young girls to actually have the top surgery, so-called, where they cut off their breasts and they transition and try to act and look like boys. And this is becoming sort of a social contagion, and having that conversation can actually get you removed from social media platforms. And it can actually get you, for example, on Amazon.com, where they sell books. You can be an author like Abigail Schreier and write a book about this social contagion among young girls. And you can actually have your book banned from Amazon so that it's wiped totally off their listing. You can't even order it on Amazon. And that actually happened to Abigail Schreier. And this woman is not a conservative. She's not a Christian. She actually is a liberal, but she's a liberal in the classic sense of liberalism, where there were personal freedoms that were prioritized. And you get freedom of speech and freedom of association and all of the classical freedoms that classic liberalism used to espouse. But now there is this totalitarian sort of what we call social Marxism, where the technique is you don't allow free speech, you actually just impose a view on people, and then you ban or censor all of the other views that are contrary. And this is what they did in Soviet Union. They did it a little differently, but they did it. And that's what they do now in China right now as we speak. This is the kind of censorship that happens in China. It happened in Nazi Germany. All of the totalitarian regimes don't trust humans to be able to process information on their own. They don't trust humans that they can think through these problems and think through these issues and grapple and weigh issues and balance and weight and balance the pros and cons of something and make wise decisions on their own. They have to impose a position and then reinforce it by censorship. And that's what we're seeing today. We're still seeing it by the media outlets, the mainstream media outlets, and social media outlets. And this is something that as Christians we have to deal with because it's a reality.
And by my show, the Eric Metaxas show, was flourishing on YouTube, getting more and more subscribers. I'm very eclectic, so I'm, some of it is comedy, some of it is serious discussions about faith, some of it is politics, some of it is I'm interviewing authors about their books. 2 years ago, I dared to have Naomi Wolf, who was one of my classmates at Yale, liberal feminist. I had her on the show.
I interviewed
to
her.
talk talk about. I know, to talk about vaccine. I didn't even choose the subject. I had a few other people on the show to talk about some things, but the show was not focused, on those kinds of things. But YouTube wiped my program out completely. Didn't just take some videos down. Wiped the entire program. The Eric Metaxas show ceased to exist.
I remember that time. It was during COVID. I think it might have been in the year 2020. And he was talking about all kinds of interesting topics. I used to listen to that program all the time. And he would have all kinds of interesting guests, and he would talk to them, just like Jordan Peterson is doing now. He is interviewing different people. Eric Metaxas would do that on YouTube. And then all of a sudden, YouTube simply erases him, disappears him from the platform. Why? Because he dared to discuss things that YouTube didn't want discussed, and he talked about them from a perspective that the elites at YouTube did not agree with. And so instead of letting free speech happen in society and letting ideas and exchange and letting the ideas, the weight of the ideas actually determine what happens, and people in their own ability to understand and debate and discuss ideas, let them come to their own conclusions. YouTube and the other social media platforms too. It was almost like there was a switch and they all acted in unison, and they began to ban content creators and speakers and podcast hosts and television shows and all kinds of things all at once, because they did not trust that people listening to free ideas exchange could come to their own conclusions. And it was shocking.
On YouTube. And I thought to myself, if you're standing back objectively looking at the situation, you'd say, well, that's interesting. Why would they do that? In other words, this doesn't look good for the people at YouTube. They look like fascists. They are acting in a fascist way. They are globalists. They are cultural Marxists. But of course, there's a good dose of fascism in there. They don't believe in freedom. They don't believe in free speech. They have an agenda, and they have tremendous power, which they are now using because, as we all know, they are scared to death of the truth. They are so scared that they're willing to look like the monsters that they are because they have nothing left to lose. So when we say, what are the parallels to Germany in the 30s? You don't suppose that in 1933, most people knew what was coming. Nobody could have dreamt of the death camps. I mean,
and also It's an exercise in raw power. That's another way of putting it. In other words, there are different ways of persuading people if you have an idea. And for example, Christianity, we preach the gospel. The evangelists go out and speak, some in small venues, others in large stadiums, some one-to-one, others in groups. There are all kinds of situations, but we speak, and it's the power of the message that converts people. But under the fascist dictatorships and communist totalitarianism, what happens is they don't trust the freedom of the individual to come to their own conclusions. They compel people to accept for example, the Russian communist system. When Lenin led the Bolshevik Revolution and took over the Imperial Russia, he began to rule with an ironclad fist. And the reason he did is because he did not believe that mere persuasion, he did not believe that simply explaining communism to the people and educating them on the teachings of communism was enough. So what he did was anyone who disagreed with him, he would disappear them. He would execute them. He would send them to Siberia in the concentration camps or the work camps in exile, the Gulag. And that's exactly the same thing that Hitler did to political opponents. He would either kill them or send them off to concentration camps, along with trying to wipe out the Jews. And this is the way all dictatorships and totalitarians act. They don't want free speech. They don't want an open and free conversation. They don't want a freedom exchange of ideas. They simply want to exercise their pure political power. And that's what people are doing here in the United States. And we haven't seen that before like this before. We saw it during COVID. We see it now with this LGBTQ movement, where there's this imposition of a certain position on all of these issues. And if you don't toe the line, you are canceled, your careers are ruined. People in Hollywood right now, if they are to exist at all and to survive there, they cannot speak a true, authentic Christian position on, for example, marriage and family, human sexuality. They simply cannot do that openly, or else they will be canceled in Hollywood and they will not act, they will not have work in Hollywood anymore. And this is getting worse and worse and worse. We're seeing a rise in this totalitarianism and also a collusion with government and big tech. So you have a radical leftist Democratic Party in control now of the White House and of the Senate, and they flex that power along with the mainstream media outlets. And you have all these major institutions like the universities and colleges and big business all coalescing into this massive totalitarian state. And freedom of speech is not high on their list of priorities. Power and getting what they want and their will is number one for them. It's a very, very disturbing situation we're in.
They didn't discuss the final solution for another 8 years. Nobody saw what was coming, but people with eyes to see, people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, they could smell this. They said, if you follow the dots, they lead in this direction. The people who are seizing power now and being allowed to seize power now by cowardly people, by confused people, those people trying to seize power, when they get the power, they're going to use it for very wicked ends. Their presuppositions are the antitheses of our presuppositions. They are atheistic. They don't believe in good or evil. They only believe in power. And the cultural elites, the globalist cultural elites today are working with the same presuppositions. They couldn't care less about the things that most of us would take for granted, the dignity of the human being, the sanctity of life, all of these things that people have lived for and died for. They are not only not interested in those ideas, they're at war with those ideas. And so there are, some parallels that we can make and some that we can't make. But basically, you and I have never seen anything like this in the West. And it's astonishing the speed at which these things have been happening.
And what his book is about is how Christian leadership in the West, particularly in the United States, and denominational leaders and parachurch ministries and leading Christian influencers have been essentially living in denial of this censorship reality. They've been living as if we're back 50, 100 years ago, when you could talk about Christian things, you could talk about any of the topics you wanted to, and you wouldn't be censored out, you wouldn't be canceled, you wouldn't be shamed, you wouldn't have your career ended. And that was the way it was before. But now we're in a new reality, and a lot of churches want to pretend, and a lot of pastors, especially huge megachurch pastors, because they don't want to upset people, they don't want to be negative, they don't want to be scary to their congregational members. They want, when people come to church, to have everything positive and happy and joyful and positive, encouraging, and they don't want any of the negativity of the culture in the church. The problem is we're facing dangers. That's the problem. We're facing real life dangers, and we can't deny it. We can't pretend it's not there. We can't wish it away. We can pray that God does something, but to pray in order that God does something, you have to first acknowledge that there is a problem to pray for. And a lot of churches, they just simply won't acknowledge that we have this totalitarian censorship, this enemy of Christianity coming right at us full speed. And so this book by Eric Metaxas, A Letter to the American Church, it's a really good book in outlining what we're facing right now here in the United States. And he's paralleling it with what happened in Germany during the rise of Hitler, where good people, good pastors, good churches, good Christians were silent. They didn't want to rock the boat. They didn't want to get in trouble. And they stuck to their four walls of the church. And they went to church and they lived their Christian lives, but they didn't say, hey, that's wrong, and rebuke error and rebuke sin when they saw it before their eyes. And that's what a lot of churches and pastors are doing today. They're just living their Christian lives and going about as normal, instead of saying, hey, that's wrong, that's evil, we're in spiritual warfare. Instead of facing that reality, they're pretending it isn't there, or trying to pretend, but that's not very successful. Well, I hope that this has been a wake-up call for a lot of people, and we need to continue to pray for our nation and pray that God will send revival while there's hope. We'll see you back next week. God bless.